Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive. We spend a lot of time here dissecting fascinating research, and today's topic is no different. Ever catch yourself wondering why some people seem so driven when it comes to academics, while others, well, not so much? It all really comes down to something called identification with academics, and trust me, this goes way deeper than just liking school or being good at it.
Right. It's about how central, how core that idea of academic success is to your sense of self. We'll be diving into some pretty insightful research today, looking at how this identification thing actually connects to your motivation and ultimately to what you achieve academically.
And that's really our mission for today, to uncover how your sense of self can actually shape your academic journey. It's amazing to think about all the factors that are at play behind the scenes. We'll be using a bunch of sources for this deep dive, by the way, so we'll make sure to drop those links in the show notes for you to explore later.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I find so interesting about this topic is that while the term itself might seem kind of new agey, the underlying concept is anything but. Way back in the late 1800s, the pioneering psychologist William James, he actually talked about this idea that we all sort of select certain cells to invest in.
Oh, yeah, I've read a bit about that. It's like we almost stake our self-worth on these chosen identities.
Exactly. And he argued that those choices, those cells we pick, they end up influencing what really motivates us and the goals and outcomes that we strive for in our lives. And that idea, as simple as it sounds, really sets the stage for this modern concept of domain identification.
I see the connection. So it's about these specific areas where we pour our energy and attention and where our successes and failures really hit home on a personal level.
Right. And one of those domains, of course, is academics.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit further because I know there can be some confusion about what we actually mean by identification with academics. I think it's helpful to differentiate between two key concepts here. Your academic self-concept, that's basically how you perceive your own competence in academic stuff, like how good you think you are at math or writing. And then there's your academic self-esteem, which is more about how you feel about those abilities. So you might be really good at science, let's say, but not really care about it all that much.
And that's the crucial difference. You can be competent in a domain without necessarily valuing it.
Right. But when academics become a domain that you strongly identify with, meaning it's a core part of who you see yourself as, then your successes and setbacks in that area start to have a much bigger impact on your overall self-esteem.
It becomes much more personal. And the way this whole process works can actually be understood through the lens of what's called symbolic interactionism.
Okay, so it's not just about our personal opinions. Our environment also plays a role in shaping how we see ourselves.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Symbolic interactionism basically says that our sense of self is constantly being shaped and reshaped through our interactions with the world around us. So in the context of academics, imagine it as this ongoing cycle. You receive feedback from your environment, you ace a test, your teacher praises your work, you see how you stack up against your classmates. Then you interpret that feedback, and that's where things get interesting.
And that interpretation is so subjective, right? It's influenced by our past experiences, our beliefs about ourselves.
Absolutely. And that often involves comparing ourselves to others, which is something that both William James way back when and later Leon Festinger, they both emphasized in their work on social comparison.
Makes sense. We're always trying to figure out where we stand and how we measure up.
Right. And based on how you interpret that feedback, it gets incorporated into your academic self-concept, your underlying belief in your academic abilities.
So if you consistently receive positive feedback and you internalize that, you start to see yourself as someone who is academically capable.
Exactly. And that in turn influences your academic self-esteem, how you feel about your competence in that domain. And as we were discussing earlier, if academics are a central part of your identity, that academic self-esteem has a huge impact on your overall self-worth. And here's the important part, your actual academic results, they also feed back into this whole cycle.
So it's a two-way street. Our experiences shape how we see ourselves, but then how we see ourselves also influences our future actions and outcomes.
Precisely. It's a continuous and dynamic interplay between your perception of yourself and your actual performance.
Hmm.
And this actually brings up a really interesting question. Does doing well lead you to identify with academics, or does identifying with academics lead you to do well?
That's a great question. It's like the classic chicken or egg dilemma.
And honestly, the research seems to point to both directions being at play. There's definitely evidence that we tend to value the things we're good at. That's been shown in research by people like Tesser and Campbell and Susan Harder. But at the same time, there's a lot of research to suggest that when you see academics as truly important to who you are, that can really drive you to put in more effort, which then improves your performance. So it's this really cool back and forth relationship.
This is all fascinating, but it makes me wonder about something. Okay, so we're talking about identifying with academics, but we all identify with different areas in our lives, right? Like our hobbies, our relationships, our social groups. So is there an optimal number of these domains that we should try to be highly identified with?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question.
Hmm.
To be honest, the research is kind of sparse when it comes to pinning down a specific ideal number. But the general idea is that if you're only really strongly identified with one or two domains, well, that could make your self-esteem a bit vulnerable.
Right. It's like putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah. Exactly. If those one or two areas are going well, you're on top of the world. But if things start to fall apart in one of those areas, it can really hit you hard.
Makes sense.
On the flip side, being super identified with like a ton of different domains, well, that could lead to you spreading your energy too thin and maybe not being able to fully excel in any one area.
So it sounds like it's all about striking a balance.
I think so. Some researchers have suggested that maybe somewhere between 5 and 10 strongly identified domains might be a sweet spot. But again, more research is definitely needed here. And actually, one of the really intriguing things about this whole idea of optimal identification is that it could potentially shed light on certain psychological issues.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. Like maybe some mental health challenges could be related to not having enough domains to draw on for your sense of self, or maybe even having too many.
Exactly. That's one avenue that researchers are starting to explore. It really highlights how important this balance can be.
It's all about finding that Goldilocks zone, not too few, not too many.
Right. And that actually brings us to another important question. What happens when things aren't going so well in a domain you're highly identified with?
Yeah, that must be really tough, especially when we're talking about academics where there's so much pressure to succeed. Like, what happens if a student is consistently struggling in school and their sense of self is tied to being a good student?
Well, that's where things can get tricky. It's not surprising that students who are facing ongoing academic challenges might actually start to reduce how much they identify with academics as a way of protecting their self-esteem.
Makes sense. If something is constantly making you feel bad, you're going to want to distance yourself from it.
Exactly. And this idea is actually supported by a lot of research, particularly the work of Crocker and Major and Claude Steele, who did some really groundbreaking work on stereotype threat. It's basically a psychological defense mechanism, your mind's way of trying to shield you from the emotional pain of feeling inadequate.
So it's kind of like a self-preservation tactic.
Precisely. And back in 1989, the researcher Finn, he proposed that this process of disidentification often starts happening way before a student might actually drop out of school.
So even before they make that decision to leave, they've already started to detach themselves from that part of their identity.
Right. He even suggested that this could explain why some studies haven't found big differences in self-esteem between students who dropped out and those who stayed in school at the time of dropping out. Because the students who left may have already shifted their primary identifications to other areas, like their social groups or their hobbies. And this is where the work of Osborne becomes really relevant. His research has shown that students who experience a decline in academic identification often start to identify more strongly with peer relationships or athletics. And those who ultimately end up dropping out tend to have higher levels of non-academic identification earlier on. It's like they're shifting their focus and investing their sense of self in other places.
I see. So it's not just about a lack of identification with academics, but also about an increase in identification with other domains that maybe feel more rewarding or less threatening to their self-esteem.
Exactly. And this really brings us to another key question. If your sense of self isn't all that connected to academics, then what's the motivation to put in the effort? What's driving you?
Yeah, why bother studying and working hard if it doesn't really matter to you on a deep level?
Right. We can think about this in terms of operant conditioning. As humans, we are driven by rewards and punishments. And researchers like Greenberg and Steele and Tesser, they've all argued that having a positive view of yourself feels inherently rewarding, while having a negative view of yourself feels punishing. So for students who strongly identify with academics getting good grades and understanding the material well, those are inherently rewarding because they contribute to a positive self-image.
They reinforce that sense of, I'm good at this, I'm capable, I'm smart, which feels good.
Exactly. And on the flip side, poor academic performance for these students, it feels like a punishment because it threatens that positive self-view.
It chips away at their self-esteem.
Right. But if you don't really identify with academics, those academic outcomes have a much weaker effect on your self-esteem. The reward for success is smaller, and the sting of failure is less intense, and that naturally impacts your motivation. You just don't feel the same push or pull to excel.
Right, the stakes just aren't as high.
Exactly.
Listening to all this, it makes me think about other concepts in the world of motivation that seem to overlap with this whole idea of identification with academics. Are there other frameworks or theories that explore similar ideas?
Absolutely. There are quite a few related concepts that touch on this same underlying idea of how much we value and connect with different aspects of our lives.
Mm.
One that comes to mind is something called attainment value, from the expectancy value theory developed by Eccles and Wigfield.
Okay, I've heard of that one. It's about how important it is to us personally to do well at something right.
Precisely. Attainment value refers to how much you care about succeeding at a task or within a particular domain. And Eccles herself has actually pointed out that tasks become important to us when they're seen as central to our sense of self.
So there's a clear link there to domain identification. If you see being good at math as important to who you are, you're going to place a higher attainment value on succeeding in math.
Exactly. But there is a slight distinction here. Attainment value is often looked at on a very task-specific level, like how much you care about doing well on this particular math problem, whereas identification with academics is more of a broader domain-level construct, like how much you care about being good at math in general.
I see. So one is more granular and the other is more global.
Right. But in practice, attainment value is often measured at the domain level too, like in math or English. So the lines do get a bit blurry.
So they're definitely closely related concepts. What are some other similar ideas?
Well, another one is from self-determination theory, specifically the ideas of identified regulation and integrated regulation. These are part of a bigger framework developed by Deci and Ryan.
Oh, yeah, self-determination theory. It's all about the different types of motivation, right? Like whether we're doing something because we have to or because we want to.
Right. Identified regulation and integrated regulation, they both represent more autonomous forms of motivation where you've internalized the value of the behavior. You're not doing it because someone is forcing you to. You're doing it because you see it as important and meaningful to you.
So with identified regulation, you consciously recognize the importance of the behavior and you accept it as your own. And with integrated regulation, it goes even further, where that value becomes fully aligned with your other values and your overall sense of self.
Exactly. And both of those are closely tied to this idea identification.
Mm.
You value something because it aligns with who you are and who you want to be.
It becomes part of your identity.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the concept of interest, specifically how interest develops over time.
Oh, yeah, interest. That's a big one when it comes to learning.
Huge. Heidi and Renninger, they proposed this four-phase model of interest development. And the later stages of this model, they involve this sense of valuing and identifying with the content.
So it's not just about being curious about something in the moment, but actually seeing it as personally significant and connected to who you are.
Exactly. It's a deeper level of engagement. And we can even broaden this out to ideas like social identity and collective identity, which explore how we define ourselves in relation to different groups and communities.
It's all about belonging and feeling a sense of connection.
Right. And then finally, there's the concept of possible selves, which was introduced by Marcus Aurelius.
Mm.
This idea is all about how our aspirations and fears for the future can actually influence the importance we place on different areas in our lives right now, including academics.
Oh, that's interesting. So like if you imagine yourself as a doctor someday, you're probably going to identify more strongly with science and value doing well in those classes now.
Precisely. Your possible selves can shape your current priorities and your sense of what's important.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different concepts that are all sort of swirling around this central idea of valuing and identifying with the domain. But what about the actual evidence? Do we actually have proof that this identification with academics really translates into real differences in how students perform?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? And the good news is there's actually a growing body of research from different fields that supports this link. For instance, in the world of work, there's been a lot of research showing that employees who strongly identify with their jobs, they tend to be more engaged, more committed, and ultimately better performers.
That makes intuitive sense. If you see your work as an extension of yourself, you're going to care more about doing it well.
Exactly. And in the parenting literature, there's been some fascinating research showing that a father's identification with his role as a parent is actually linked to greater involvement with his children. He's like, the more he sees being a dad as central to who he is, the more invested he is in that role.
So it's not just about academics. This principle seems to apply across different areas of our lives.
Absolutely. And even in vocational training, there's evidence to suggest that a student's identification with a particular vocation is related to their career choices and how committed they are to that path.
Okay, so we're seeing this pattern across different domains, but what about specifically in the academic world? What does the research say about the link between identification with academics and actual academic performance?
Yeah, so let's dive into the academic research. One really compelling study was done by Osborne back in 1997 with college freshmen. He found that those who started their first year with a stronger identification with academics, they ended up having higher GPAs. They were more likely to receive academic honors, and importantly, they were less likely to be put on academic probation or get dismissed from school in the next 2 years. So that's a pretty strong link.
Yeah, that suggests that identification can really have a significant impact on long-term outcomes.
Right. And Volkel's research with secondary school students found a similar connection between academic identification and both higher achievement and greater participation in class.
So they're not just getting better grades, they're also more actively engaged in the learning process.
Exactly. And there's even more evidence to support this link. Osborne did some unpublished work along with a study he did with Rausch, and they found that in high school students, academic identification was related to a bunch of positive things. Deeper engagement with the material, better self-regulation skills, having more ambitious academic goals, and then, of course, better academic outcomes like higher GPAs. But they also found that it was linked to fewer behavioral problems like getting in trouble or skipping school.
That's really interesting. So it's not just about doing well academically, but also about being more well-adjusted overall.
Precisely. And these findings have actually been echoed in large-scale national surveys, too. These surveys have shown that students who report higher levels of academic identification, they tend to be more motivated, more engaged in their learning, and they achieve better academic results overall. Plus, they're less likely to do things like skip class or even drop out of school entirely.
So it really does seem like a protective factor.
Yeah. And on the flip side, there's been research with students in alternative schools, the ones that are specifically for students with behavioral issues. And this research has found that those students tend to have much lower levels of academic identification compared to their peers in traditional schools.
I see. So there's a clear correlation there.
And all this research really aligns with what Eccles found with her expectancy value model. Remember we talked about how attainment value, which is very similar to academic identification, is a strong predictor of academic outcomes. And then there's also Marsh and his colleagues who have done a lot of research showing that a positive self-concept in math can actually fuel greater interest and success in math down the road.
Okay, so the what seems pretty clear. There's a strong relationship between identification with academics and positive academic outcomes. But I'm curious about the why. Like, what are the mechanisms that actually explain this connection? We were talking about that model earlier. Can you unpack that a bit more for us?
Sure. So our model, it basically lays out the different factors that influence identification and how that then translates into academic outcomes. And what it suggests is that your initial level of identification with academics, it's actually influenced by a bunch of background factors. This includes things like your group affiliations, your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your socioeconomic background, and then also the influence of your family, your peers, the community you live in, the overall climate of your school environment, and, of course, your individual experiences with education both inside and outside the classroom.
So it's a complex mix of nature and nurture.
Definitely. And within those experiences, there are a few key elements that are particularly important. Things like feeling a sense of autonomy or control over your learning process, understanding how what you're learning is actually useful and relevant to your goals, believing that you can actually succeed, being genuinely interested in the material, and feeling a sense of belonging and connection to the school community.
So it's about creating a learning environment that feels supportive, engaging, and relevant to the student's life.
Exactly. And when those elements are present and they lead to stronger identification, well, that sets off a chain reaction of positive effects. Students become more engaged, they put in more effort, they persevere through challenges, they develop positive academic goals and beliefs about themselves. And all that translates into better academic behaviors, showing up to class, doing their homework, using effective study strategies. And ultimately, those behaviors lead to positive academic outcomes.
So it's a really beautiful cycle when it's working well.
It is. But unfortunately, the opposite is also true. When students have a weak identification with academics, it increases the likelihood of those negative outcomes because they're just not as motivated to engage or persevere. The driving force isn't there.
They haven't bought into the idea that academics are important or relevant to them.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about the benefits of strong identification, but I'm curious, Could there actually be downsides to being too strongly identified with academics? That sounds kind of counterintuitive, but is there such a thing as caring too much?
Yeah, it is a little counterintuitive, but yes, there are some potential downsides to consider.
I'm all ears.
Well, one really important example is the work that Claude Steele has done on stereotype threat. This is a phenomenon where students from groups that are negatively stereotyped in certain academic domains, if they also happen to be highly identified with those domains, they can experience intense anxiety about confirming those stereotypes. And sadly, this anxiety can actually undermine their performance.
Oh, wow. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
In a way, and Osborne's research has also shown that this can even lead some students to withdraw from the domain entirely, or to start devaluing it as a way to protect themselves.
So they might start to downplay the importance of academics as a way to cope with that pressure and anxiety.
Exactly, and that's heartbreaking because these are often students who are incredibly bright and capable, but who are being held back by these societal
Yeah,
stereotypes.
that's a really complex and challenging issue.
It is. Another potential downside is that some students who are super identified with academics, they might find it really hard to devalue academics even when they're facing persistent failure.
So even if they're struggling and it's causing them a lot of stress, they can't let go of that part of their identity.
Right. Because their academic performance is so central to how they see themselves, repeated negative outcomes can be really damaging to their self-esteem. And this can lead to a lot of frustration and even some unhealthy coping mechanisms.
So it's almost like a double-edged sword. Strong identification can be a powerful motivator, but it can also make you more vulnerable in certain situations.
Exactly. And this is especially relevant when we think about women in STEM fields. While a strong identification with STEM can be a huge driving force, it can also make them more susceptible to the negative effects of gender stereotypes that are unfortunately still prevalent in those fields. Interestingly, though, some research by Schmatter has suggested that how central a woman's gender identity is to her overall sense of self can actually play a role in how strongly stereotype threat impacts her performance in STEM.
Okay, so the strength of your identification with one domain can be influenced by how strongly you identify with other domains. It's all connected.
Exactly. It's this intricate web of identities.
Fascinating. This whole conversation has got me thinking about something else. We've talked about the potential downsides of being too identified, but could strong academic identification actually help to prevent negative behaviors in school?
That's a really interesting question. And actually, there's some evidence to suggest that it might. Social control theory, for example, it suggests that a lack of connection to conventional institutions like school can be a risk factor for delinquent behavior. So if a student feels a strong sense of belonging and identification with their school and their academic pursuits, they're less likely to act in ways that would jeopardize that connection.
It's like they have more to lose.
Exactly. And remember how James talked about how harming something you identify with is almost like harming yourself? Well, for a student who's really invested in their academic identity, the idea of getting in trouble or getting kicked out of school, that's a huge deterrent. They don't want to damage that part of themselves.
And there's actually research to support this idea too, right?
Yes. Finn and Frone, they did a study that found that even among students who are academically struggling, those with higher levels of identification with academics were actually less likely to cheat.
That's really compelling. So it seems like strong identification can act as a buffer against negative behaviors.
There's definitely a possibility there.
Okay, so this identification with academics, it seems like a really crucial factor in understanding student motivation and behavior. But how do researchers actually go about measuring something that feels so internal and personal?
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges in this area of research. Measuring something that's essentially a feeling or a sense of self, it's not easy.
Right. You can't just stick a thermometer in someone's brain and measure their level of identification.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So historically, a lot of the research, especially this stuff on stereotype threat and school withdrawal, it's relied on more indirect measures of identification. For example, researchers might look at things like whether students enroll in more challenging courses or how well they do on standardized tests, and then sort of infer from that that they must be highly identified with academics.
But those are really just proxies, right? They're not actually measuring the student's internal experience of how central academics are to their sense of self.
Exactly. And even asking students about their perceived academic ability or how much they value a subject, well, those things are related, but they don't quite capture that deeper sense of identification.
They don't get at the core of it.
Right. What we really need to do is assess how important the academic domain is to the individual's overall identity and self-worth.
So, are there measures that try to do that more directly?
Fortunately, yes. There are a couple of measures that have been developed specifically to assess academic identification. One is called the School Perceptions Questionnaire, or SPQ, which was developed by Osborne, and another is called the Identification with School Measure, which was created by Volkel.
And what do these measures actually look at?
Well, Volkel's measure, it includes questions about things like how much the student feels like they belong in the school environment and how much they value schooling in general. Osborne's SPQ, it's got these subscales that try to measure the extent to which a student defines themselves through their academic achievements and how much those achievements impact their overall sense of self.
So, they're getting at that deeper sense of connection and personal meaning.
Right. And the research has generally shown that both of these measures are pretty reliable and valid. And importantly, they can actually predict important academic outcomes, which suggests that they're tapping into something meaningful.
That's great.
Yeah. There are also a few other related measures that researchers sometimes use, like Eccles attainment value scales and some scales from self-determination theory that look at identified and integrated regulation, even some scales that were originally designed to measure how much people devalue a domain as a way of coping with difficulty. Those have been adapted to measure identification indirectly.
It's amazing how creative researchers have to be to measure something that's so intangible.
It is.
This whole conversation has been so illuminating. It really makes you reflect on your own experiences with school and learning. But I know a lot of our listeners are educators or parents, and they're probably wondering what they can actually do to boost a student's identification with academics. Like, are there concrete strategies that can be used to make a difference?
Yeah, that's the key, right? It's all well and good to understand this concept, but what can we actually do with this knowledge? And that's where a model called the music model comes in. It was developed by Jones, and it outlines 5 key strategies for increasing identification with academics.
Okay, I like where this is going. Let's break it down. What's the first strategy?
So the first one is all about empowering students. It's about fostering their sense of autonomy and control over their own learning experiences. And this can be done in a lot of different ways. Teachers can use more autonomy-supportive language. They can offer students choices in their assignments and topics. They can generally just be more supportive of students' need for self-direction. There's a ton of research to show that students who have teachers who are autonomy supportive, they tend to be more engaged, they learn more deeply, and they actually have more positive emotions in the classroom. Even little things like the way instructions are phrased can make a difference. Like instead of saying you have to do this, a teacher could say, here are some options you can choose from, or how do you think you want to approach this task?
So it's about giving students agency.
Exactly. And giving students meaningful choices in their work has been shown to be really effective too. It doesn't have to be everything, but even just giving them some control over certain aspects of their learning can make a big difference.
Makes sense.
And this applies to parents too. Parental autonomy support in the home environment that's been linked to a bunch of positive outcomes for kids, including better academic motivation. So it's really a team effort.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got empowering students. What's the next strategy in the M-Music model?
The second strategy is all about demonstrating usefulness. It's about helping students to see how what they're learning actually connects to their goals, both in the short term and in the long term. And teachers can do a lot to help with this. They can explicitly highlight how academic concepts are relevant to everyday life and to potential future careers.
So it's about making those connections clear.
Exactly. And school counselors can play a really important role here too, by providing students with information about different educational pathways and career options.
Right. It's about helping students see the bigger picture.
Yeah. And it's also important to make sure that the curriculum itself is perceived as valuable and relevant. This might involve rethinking how we present certain subjects or even reconsidering how we structure different academic tracks. Like, we need to stop thinking of vocational and alternative educational paths as somehow lesser than the traditional college prep track.
Right. All types of learning can be valuable and lead to fulfilling careers.
Absolutely. And the more we can do to highlight that, the better.
Okay, so we've got empowering students, demonstrating usefulness. What's the third strategy in a music model?
So the third strategy is focused on supporting students' success. And this goes back to that idea that we tend to value and identify with the areas where we experience some level of success.
Right. We like doing things we're good at.
Exactly. So educators need to create learning experiences that are challenging enough to be engaging but also achievable for students.
It's about finding that sweet spot between pushing them and overwhelming them.
Right. And then providing constructive feedback and support along the way is essential. So it's not just about throwing them in the deep end and hoping they'll swim. It's about being there to guide and encourage them. And one thing that's really important here is avoiding those lower academic tracks that can lead to boredom and disengagement.
Right. Those tracks can send the message that certain students aren't capable of higher level learning, which can be incredibly damaging.
Absolutely. And another key piece of supporting student success is encouraging what's called a growth mindset. This is the idea that intelligence and ability, they're not fixed, they're malleable.
You can always learn and grow.
Exactly. And when students have a growth mindset, they're more likely to see challenges as opportunities for learning, and they're less afraid of making mistakes. And this ties in with promoting mastery goals, which are all about focusing on learning and understanding for the sake of learning, rather than just trying to outperform others.
So it's about shifting the focus from competition to personal growth.
Exactly. And finally, using criterion-referenced assessments instead of norm-referenced assessments can also be really helpful. With criterion-referenced assessments, success is measured against a set standard rather than against the performance of other students. So it takes the focus off of social comparison and lets more students experience a sense of accomplishment.
Oh, that's a great point. It's about creating a more supportive and less competitive learning environment. Okay, so we've got empowering students, demonstrating usefulness, supporting success. What's the fourth strategy in the music model?
The fourth one is all about triggering and supporting interests. And this might seem pretty straightforward, but it's often overlooked. Interest, as we mentioned before, it's a huge driver of motivation and engagement.
If you're interested in something, you're going to pay more attention, you're going to put in more effort, you're going to enjoy the process more.
Exactly. And there are different types of interest. There's what's called situational interest, which is that kind of fleeting spark of curiosity that you might feel when something is new or surprising or exciting. And then there's individual interest, which is that deeper, more enduring interest that develops over time when you really connect with the subject.
So teachers can use different strategies to tap into both types of interest, right?
Exactly. To trigger that initial situational interest, teachers can incorporate things like novelty, social interaction, games, storytelling, hands-on activities into their lessons. It's about making learning fun and engaging and capturing students' attention. And even little things like adding an element of surprise or complexity to a task can make a big difference.
It's about shaking things up and keeping students on their toes.
Right. And then to nurture those individual interests, that's where things like connecting new information to students' existing knowledge and passions come in.
Building those bridges.
Exactly. And then providing students with challenges that are appropriately matched to their skill level, giving them access to resources that will help them explore their interests further, and being role models who demonstrate their own enthusiasm for learning all of those things can help to cultivate those deeper, more lasting interests.
It's about creating a learning environment that feels stimulating and supportive of curiosity.
Right.
Okay, so we've covered empowering students, demonstrating usefulness, supporting success, triggering and supporting interests. What's the fifth and final strategy in the in-music model?
The fifth one is all about fostering a sense of belongingness. And this is huge. Students need to feel like they're valued members of the school and classroom community.
Like they truly belong.
Exactly. And a big part of this comes down to the relationships that students have with their teachers. Teachers who are caring and supportive, who are attuned to their students' needs, and who create a classroom environment that feels safe and respectful, those teachers make a huge difference.
They create a space where students feel comfortable taking risks and being themselves.
Exactly. And positive peer relationships are also crucial. Feeling connected to your classmates and having a supportive social network at school that can make a world of difference.
It's about feeling like